Beverly Hills Hotel, California, February 28, 1973. The 15th annual Grammy Award ceremony was reaching its climax, and Elvis Presley sat at his table in the International Ballroom, wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The presenter on stage was about to announce the winner for Best Male Pop Vocal Performance, a category where Elvis's recording of Burning Love had been nominated. The song had been a massive hit, reaching number 2 on the Billboard charts and demonstrating that Elvis, at 38, could still create music that captured the imagination of audiences worldwide. And the Grammy goes to... The presenter paused for dramatic effect. Harry Nilsson for Without You. Elvis applauded politely as Nilsson walked to the stage, but those sitting closest to him could see the disappointment flash across his face. It was a look that had become familiar to Elvis's inner circle over the past 15 years. The expression of a man who had revolutionized popular music but couldn't seem to earn recognition from his own industry for the very songs that had changed the world. As Nilsson accepted his award and thanked the Recording Academy, Elvis was quietly calculating a statistic that would have shocked anyone who heard it. Despite being the most influential rock and roll artist in history, despite selling hundreds of millions of records, despite fundamentally changing the course of popular music, Elvis Presley had never won a Grammy Award for a rock and roll song. Not one. Not ever. The only 3 Grammy Awards Elvis would ever receive were for his gospel recordings He Knows Just What I Need in 1967, He Touched Me in 1972, and How Great Thou Art in 1974. While Elvis cherished these awards and was genuinely proud of his gospel music, the message from the Recording Academy was unmistakable. Elvis's rock and roll contributions weren't worthy of recognition, but his gospel music was acceptable to the establishment. This is the documented story of one of the most shocking injustices in Grammy Awards history, a systematic snubbing of the king of rock and roll that reveals the music industry's deep-seated bias against the very genre that Elvis had created and that would eventually dominate popular culture. The Grammy Awards were established in 1958 by the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, ostensibly to recognize excellence in recorded music. But from the very beginning, the awards reflected the tastes and prejudices of an establishment music industry that was deeply suspicious of rock and roll and the cultural changes it represented. The first Grammy Awards ceremony, held in 1959, honored recordings from 1958, the same year that Elvis had dominated the charts with songs like Hard-Headed Woman and Don't Ask Me Why. Yet Elvis received no nominations, no recognition, and no acknowledgement from an industry that owed its transformation to his innovations. The pattern was established immediately, and would continue for the next 2 decades. Elvis's most groundbreaking and influential recordings, Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, All Shook Up, Jailhouse Rock, Suspicious Minds, That's All Right, were systematically ignored by Grammy voters who seemed determined to pretend that rock and roll wasn't real music. The bias wasn't subtle. While Elvis was selling millions of records and filling concert halls around the world, Grammy Awards were going to traditional pop singers, jazz artists, and classical musicians who represented the musical establishment that rock and roll was displacing. In 1960, while Elvis's It's Now or Never was breaking sales records worldwide, the Grammy for Best Male Vocal Performance went to Harry Belafonte for Swing Dat Hammer. In 1961, while Elvis was serving in the Army and his recordings were still dominating radio playlists, the same category went to Jack Jones for Lollipops and Roses. The message was clear. The Recording Academy valued smooth, safe, traditional vocal performance over the raw energy, emotional authenticity, and cultural significance that Elvis brought to popular music. The Grammy snubbing of Elvis becomes even more shocking when you consider the specific songs and performances that were overlooked. Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel, released as a double A-side single in 1956, spent 11 weeks at number 1 and became one of the most influential recordings in popular music history. The songs demonstrated Elvis's ability to transform rhythm and blues into something entirely new while showcasing vocal techniques that would influence generations of singers. Yet when the 1957 Grammys honored recordings from 1956, Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel weren't just passed over, they weren't even nominated. Instead, the Best Male Vocal Performance went to Perry Como for Catch a Falling Star, a pleasant but forgettable song that had none of the cultural impact or artistic innovation of Elvis's masterpiece. Jailhouse Rock, released in 1957, was another revolutionary recording that combined Elvis's vocal power with sophisticated orchestration and a driving rhythm that defined rock and roll for the next decade. The song reached number 1 on multiple charts and became one of Elvis's most enduring classics. When the 1958 Grammys were announced, Jailhouse Rock was completely ignored, while the best male vocal performance went to Perry Como again, this time for Magic Moments. The pattern continued throughout the 1960s, even as Elvis continued to create music that pushed the boundaries of popular music and demonstrated his growth as an artist. Are You Lonesome Tonight? From 1960 showcased Elvis's ability to handle delicate ballad material with sophistication and emotional depth. Can't Help Falling in Love from 1961 became one of the most beloved songs in American popular music. Suspicious Minds from 1969 marked Elvis's triumphant return to contemporary relevance and proved that he could still create cutting-edge music that spoke to new generations of listeners. None of these recordings received Grammy recognition. The psychological impact of this systematic snubbing on Elvis himself was profound and well documented by those closest to him. According to Charlie Hodge, who traveled with Elvis for most of his career, Elvis was deeply hurt by the Grammy oversight, though he rarely spoke about it publicly. Elvis cared more about respect from other musicians than he let on, Hodge recalled in his memoir. He would watch the Grammy Awards every year, hoping that maybe this time they would recognize what he had contributed to music. When they didn't, you could see it in his face. It wasn't about ego or wanting trophies. It was about wanting acknowledgement from his peers that what he was doing mattered. The pain was particularly acute because Elvis understood that the Grammy snubbing wasn't about the quality of his music. It was about the type of music he made. The same recording academy that ignored his rock and roll masterpieces, was happy to honor his gospel recordings, which were seen as more respectable and less threatening to established musical hierarchies. Elvis's first Grammy win came in 1967 for He Knows Just What I Need, part of his How Great Thou Art gospel album. While Elvis was genuinely thrilled to receive the award and deeply valued his gospel music, the implicit message was unmistakable. The Recording Academy approved of Elvis when he sang traditional religious music, but not when he created the revolutionary rock and roll that had changed the world. Elvis was grateful for the Gospel Grammy, but he also understood what it meant, observed Jerry Schilling, a longtime member of Elvis's inner circle. The industry was telling him that his real music wasn't good enough for their awards, but his gospel music was acceptable because it fit into categories they understood and approved of. The second Gospel Grammy came in 1972 for He Touched Me, and while Elvis was again honored to receive recognition, the contrast with his rock and roll career became even more stark. By 1972, Elvis had been performing and recording for nearly 2 decades, had sold hundreds of millions of records, and had fundamentally altered the landscape of popular music. Yet the only Grammy recognition he could receive was for music that represented a small fraction of his artistic output. The third and final Grammy came in 1974 for How Great Thou Art, a live recording from one of his Memphis concerts. Elvis treasured this award because it honored not just his gospel singing but his live performance abilities. But even this recognition came with an implicit limitation. The Recording Academy was honoring Elvis the gospel singer and live performer, not Elvis the rock and roll innovator who had created the template for modern popular music. The artists who won Grammy Awards instead of Elvis during his peak years reveal the Recording Academy's priorities and biases. While Elvis was being ignored, awards were going to traditional pop singers like Tony Bennett, Frank Sinatra, and Nat King Cole, all talented artists, but none of whom had revolutionized music the way Elvis had. The 1970s snubbings were particularly egregious because they occurred during Elvis's Las Vegas period when his live performances were being hailed as the pinnacle of entertainment artistry. Songs like Suspicious Minds, Burning Love, and My Boy demonstrated that Elvis had not only maintained his relevance but had continued to evolve as an artist. Yet Grammy voters continued to overlook his rock and roll work while honoring artists whose impact on popular culture was minimal compared to Elvis's seismic influence. The systematic nature of the Grammy snubbing becomes even more shocking when contrasted with the recognition Elvis received from other institutions and industry organizations. He was honored by the Country Music Association, inducted into multiple halls of fame, and received numerous awards from international music organizations. The Grammy Awards stood virtually alone among major music industry honors in their refusal to acknowledge Elvis's rock and roll contributions. The bias wasn't limited to Elvis. It reflected the Recording Academy's general hostility toward rock and roll throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. Other rock pioneers like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Jerry Lee Lewis were similarly ignored, while the Grammy Awards consistently honored more traditional and conservative musical styles. But Elvis's case was unique because of the sheer scope of his influence and the undeniable quality of his recordings. This wasn't a matter of taste or subjective judgment. Elvis had created songs that were both commercially successful and artistically innovative. that had influenced countless other musicians and that had fundamentally changed popular culture. The Recording Academy's treatment of Elvis reflected broader cultural and generational conflicts that were playing out in American society during the 1960s and 1970s. Rock and roll represented youth culture, sexual liberation, and social change, values that threatened the establishment institutions that controlled organizations like the Recording Academy. By honoring only Elvis's gospel music, the Academy was attempting to separate Elvis the person from Elvis the cultural revolutionary, acknowledging his vocal talent while rejecting the social and cultural implications of his rock and roll innovations. The impact of the Grammy snubbing extended beyond Elvis himself to the broader legitimacy of the awards and their relevance to popular music. By consistently ignoring the most influential and important recordings of the rock era, the Grammy Awards marginalized themselves and created a credibility gap that persisted for decades. Music critics and industry observers began to question whether the Grammy Awards had any meaningful connection to musical excellence or cultural significance. If the Recording Academy couldn't recognize the artistic value of Elvis Presley's rock and roll contributions, what did their awards actually represent? The situation began to change gradually in the 1980s and 1990s as rock music became more accepted by establishment institutions and as younger generations of music industry professionals took leadership roles in the Recording Academy. But the change came too late for Elvis, who died in 1977 without ever receiving recognition for the music that had made him the king of rock and roll. Elvis's feelings about the Grammy situation were complex and evolved over time. In his early career, he seemed genuinely puzzled by the lack of recognition, unable to understand why his music wasn't considered worthy of industry honors. As he matured, his disappointment became more philosophical. He understood that the snubbing reflected broader cultural conflicts rather than judgments about his artistic abilities. In a 1972 interview, one of the few times Elvis addressed the Grammy situation directly, he said, "I'm grateful for the awards I've received for my gospel music. That music means a lot to me personally. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't wonder sometimes why the other music I've made doesn't seem to count for anything with those folks. I guess they think rock and roll isn't real music." The comment revealed both Elvis's hurt and his understanding of the cultural dynamics at play. He wasn't asking for charity or special consideration. He was simply asking for the same recognition that was routinely given to artists whose impact on music was far less significant than his own. The posthumous recognition of Elvis's contributions to music has been extensive and overwhelming. He has been inducted into multiple halls of fame, honored with Lifetime Achievement Awards, and consistently ranked as one of the most important artists in popular music history. But the Grammy Award's failure to recognize his rock and roll contributions during his lifetime remains a permanent stain on the Recording Academy's credibility and a reminder of how institutional bias can blind organizations to artistic excellence. The 3 gospel Grammys that Elvis did win were genuinely deserved and represented real artistic achievement. Elvis's gospel recordings were heartfelt, sophisticated, and demonstrated his deep connection to the spiritual music that had influenced his development as an artist. But the limitation of his Grammy recognition to gospel music also represented a fundamental misunderstanding of his artistic significance and cultural impact. Elvis Presley created rock and roll. He didn't just perform it or popularize it. He literally created it by synthesizing country, blues, gospel, and pop into something entirely new that would become the dominant form of popular music for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The Recording Academy's failure to recognize this achievement represents one of the most significant oversights in awards history. The Grammy snubbing of Elvis also raises broader questions about how artistic excellence is defined and recognized. Should awards honor commercial success, cultural impact, artistic innovation, or technical proficiency? Elvis's rock and roll recordings succeeded on all these measures, yet they were consistently ignored by Grammy voters who seemed to prioritize traditional musical values over revolutionary artistic achievement. The legacy of the Grammy snubbing continues to influence how we understand both Elvis's career and the limitations of industry recognition. Elvis achieved everything a popular musician could achieve: commercial success, critical acclaim, cultural influence, and lasting artistic legacy. The fact that he couldn't achieve recognition from his own industry's most prestigious awards reveals more about the limitations of those awards than about any deficiency in Elvis's artistry. Today, most music historians and critics regard the Grammy Awards' treatment of Elvis as an embarrassing example of institutional bias and cultural short-sightedness. The recordings that Grammy voters ignored, Hound Dog, Jailhouse Rock, Suspicious Minds, Can't Help Falling in Love, are now recognized as masterpieces that defined American popular music. But for Elvis himself, the Grammy snubbing represented a painful reminder that revolutionary artists often struggle to receive recognition from the very institutions they are transforming. The king of rock and roll changed the world with his music, but he died without receiving Grammy recognition for the songs that made him a legend. The man who received only 3 Grammy Awards in his lifetime, all for gospel music, created the template for modern popular music and influenced every rock, pop, and country artist who followed him. The Recording Academy's failure to recognize his rock and roll contributions represents not just an injustice to Elvis, but a fundamental misunderstanding of musical history and artistic significance. Elvis Presley never won a Grammy Award for rock and roll because the Grammy Awards in their early decades couldn't recognize rock and roll as legitimate music. That failure says nothing about Elvis's artistic worth and everything about the limitations of institutional recognition in the face of revolutionary cultural change. The king of rock and roll didn't need Grammy Awards to validate his importance, but the Grammy Awards needed to recognize Elvis to validate their relevance to popular music. Their failure to do so remains one of the most shocking oversights in music awards history.